Well, thank you for coming out this morning. I was glad having to drive from Northfield that it wasn't what they had forecasted a couple of days ago. It was freezing rain. So just having rain, it made it nice. So I'm glad you all came out. This is of particular interest to me because at the start of my public library career, I worked at the Northfield Public Library for a couple of years before coming here. And I believe, Bruce, you were on the library board at that time. And so having worked at both libraries, I'm really looking forward to seeing what you scrounged up with both of them in our presentation today. We have with us today Dr. Bruce Caldwell, who has spent over 20 years at Carleton in higher education, mainly working with students. Bruce has a bachelor's degree in history, a master's degree in psychology or counseling, and a PhD in some sociology thing.
Education.
Education, oh yeah, PhD in education.
Administration and policy studies.
From the prestigious University of Northwestern University. Go Wildcats. Bruce has been pretty active here lately. He has done a history and research on the Northfield Public Library, which part of this presentation is based on. And he approached me, I believe, about 4, 5, 6 months ago about doing the same for the Red Wing Public Library. So to give credit here, we have legacy funds from 2 different sources to provide this presentation today. The research was funded by the Minnesota Historical, yes, get to our slide. There we go. The Clean Water Legacy Act through the Minnesota Legacy Funds, the Historical Society, which is the research funded that part of it. And then the presentation was funded through Selco's part of Legacy Amendment. So what we have today is a comparison, contrasting of the histories of 2 libraries, the Red Wing Public Library and the Northfield Public Library. And I'm going to turn this over to Bruce. You ready?
I'm ready.
Looking forward to it. Here you go.
Welcome. And if the microphone seems like a little overkill in this intimate spot, we're also videotaping it, and my voice wasn't projecting well enough, so I assume everyone, but you got to get really close to this microphone. I assume everyone can hear me. If at some point you're losing me, give me a shout. Thank you, James. And as he said, this presentation was supported by a grant from Selco. They're called community collaboration grants, and Selco is using the legacy money and distributing it to libraries. And I believe it was a Selco community collaboration fund that paid for those beautiful, James, in the children's area,
Yes, the murals up there were paid by that fund.
Right. So why this topic? And James has talked a little bit about how this came to be. As he said, I a few years ago wrote a centennial history of the Northfield Carnegie Public Library. So it was a history of the library, but it was focusing on the Carnegie building. And then about 6 months ago, I started doing some research, or this last summer and fall, began to research the history of the Red Wing Public Library. And as I was doing it, and also a few conversations with James, I just said, there's remarkable parallels and similarities, and also some significant differences. Wouldn't it be interesting to do a program just comparing the history of the 2 libraries? So that's what this is. It is not a comprehensive history of either, and as you'll see by the outline, I'm just going to focus on 5 or 6 events and periods of time. But actually, before I get into the content of it, in my research in Northfield and here, I've been impressed with the degree to which many friends and people who are associated with the library have been interested in their library history. And one of the things that I discovered was when you celebrated your centennial as a public library in 1994, there was extensive historical research done, and even producing a publication, and we have copies of them in the back, so you might want to take them. It was a newspaper insert, and Catherine Reinders and staff actually did most of the research and writing. And so unlike Northfield, where I was sort of starting from scratch, it was nice to see how much work had been done on the history of this library. And I'm assuming that many of you have had long associations with the Red Wing Library. In fact, maybe how about with a show of hands, how many of you actually were in the Carnegie Lothar Library? In other words, before 1969. And a parallel question then, so how many of you knew Edna Steiner? Yeah, although Edna was still associated with the library another decade, I think, after that. But at the end, you know, even though today's presentation will focus almost entirely on a comparison of the two libraries, hopefully in the next few months we're awaiting word on another small Historical Society legacy grant. If I get that grant, I'm going to begin writing a history of the Red Wing Public Library, and I would be interested in hearing from you any thoughts you have about the history and things that you would like me to particularly pursue. And related to that, also, after the presentations, you may have all seen this, in the back, I have put on the table a number of documents from the Red Wing archives. I guess it'd be a little too formal to call them archives, but in the storage room around the corner, there were a number of documents from the 1890s and early part of the century. So you might want to take a look at that. So on to the presentation. It will not focus very much on how the libraries operated and who the directors were and the people and service part of the library, which I think is the most important, is not what I'm going to talk about extensively today. Today it will be more comparing how the city established the library and how they came to get their Carnegie libraries, both had Carnegie libraries, and what they each did when their Carnegie libraries were no longer large enough. So we're looking at the pre-public library period, 1855 to 1890 in both places. Both public libraries were established in the 90s, 1894 here in Red Wing and 1898 in Northfield. Each got a Carnegie gift and built Carnegie libraries, and there's the two dates, Red Wing 03 and Northfield 1910. And in both places they thought the library would last about, that it would serve the needs of the community about 20, 30 years. But for various reasons, in part because of the two world wars and a depression, and probably in part because the cities really didn't grow all that much in terms of population, both of their Carnegie libraries served them well longer. As you can see, Northfield's 75 years and, do the math, about 66 here in Red Wing. But both had to expand at some point, and I'll look at how each community addressed that and what they came up with. And then just very briefly, I mean, that's going to be the heart of the presentation, but as I said, both celebrated in the 1990s, centennial celebrations, and that's centennial not of their Carnegie building, but of 100 years as a public library, a tax-supported public library. But then I did want to just briefly touch on the people part of the library. So I do have just a couple slides about the library boards, and one of the differences between Red Wing and Northfield is the nature and structure of their library boards. Red Wings is a governing board, Northfield's is an advisory board, and I'll talk a little more about what that difference meant. And I just have lists of the librarians, as they were first called, and later library directors, so you can just see. And Red Wing has had 15, and I believe Northfield only 12 directors. And then I just have a little chart that's got some circulation stats and other things to just see how the libraries compare. And then hopefully we'll have some time for questions, answers, and again, I would also hope at that point that we could talk more about what you would like to see in a history of the Red Wing Library, and we can get off the comparison. So, what did I just do? It's no longer advancing because I hit video mode. Maybe I need to. There we go. Again, just to get clear about the time periods we're looking at, this is a little bit of a confusing timeline, but both towns were founded at, I believe, the same year, although, is 1855 right? Or Red Wing, do we have any historians out there? It was a little less clear with Red Wing because Mr. Hancock is identified as the first permanent resident, but it wasn't established in a kind of formal way the way John North established Northfield. But anyway, at approximately the same time, the towns were founded. And as I said, their public libraries were established in the same decade. And their Carnegie buildings were built in the same decade. But then the new building, the expanded buildings, Red Wing 69 and Northfield didn't complete theirs until 85. So let's start with Northfield and that period of time before it was a public library. John North, who founded Northfield, was part of a community of mostly New Englanders and New Yorkers. And this quote, whose citizens shared his commitment to education, abolitionism, evangelical religion, and temperance, is from A History of Northfield by Professor Cliff Clark. But you know, John North very purposefully, when he was founding this town, these were all important to him. John North, by the way, was also one of the founders of the University of Minnesota. And then he failed in his business. His business was milling. He created a mill, and then a little later actually was trying to get a railroad to come through Northfield, but all of those attempts failed. He left the state and founded another town, Riverside, California. But Northfield, in part because I think of John North's vision and the kinds of people that came to Northfield, also within their first year set up a Lyceum Society in which they established a reading room, a circulating library, and a debating society. It was not publicly financed, but anyone could pay a little money to join the society. And so Northfield, in a sense, had a library right from its first year, which is, I think, somewhat remarkable. And also, in those first 3-4 decades, two colleges were founded, Carleton in 66 and St. Olaf in 78. And they built the first large central high school in 74. So they really were attending the kind of educational needs of the community quite early. And John North is on the left, and the gentleman on the right, Hiram Scribner, was a store owner, merchant, and he contributed a lot of money that bought books for this circulating library. And even at the time that the library was established in '94, he had died by then, but his in a couple of bequests, he gave additional money to the library. So before the city supported it, he was sort of their chief benefactor. All right, why is it? There we go. These quotes were either from the newspaper or some promotional things that Northfield was distributing at the time, but not so modest, I guess. They described their town as they were trying to attract others as a town of citizens possessed of intelligence, and that they were trying to create a society of folks of most refined and desirable character. By '89, they had more than 2,500 residents, 2 railroads, 2 colleges, 8 churches, 4 hotels, 1 flour mill, creamery, 2 banks, and that was their description. Many fine homes. And the Northfield News, I think this is about '89, boasted that their town was unquestionably the most beautiful town in the Northwest, but I think they had not been to Red Wing. I don't know how the physical environment in Northfield, it's a pretty little town, but it's pales in comparison to Red Wing, I must say. Okay, I gotta stop doing this. There we go. So this circulating library and reading room, there was also a reading association, and they actually were in 3 different places before Northfield made it a public library. It was in an old schoolhouse. It was above a store called the Shadow Store. At the very beginning, it was in that building, which a renovated version still exists in Northfield on 4th Street. It's now law offices. The Lyceum building, and then in 1985, they located in that building, which if those of you who've been to Northfield might recognize as presently the Northfield Arts Guild is housed in that building. But that was the YMCA building back in '85. That's where the library was. So in those first 40 years, Northfield had a little library and certainly had citizens that were interested in having such an institution in their town, but there was no indication in any newspapers I saw that they thought it should be a public library accessible to everyone or supported by tax money. So we go to Red Wing in that era. Red Wing was also founded by primarily by New Englanders and then some immigrants from Germany and Norway and Great Britain. Had more industry early on, and as you probably all know, lumber, stoneware, some ironworks, milling, and particularly shipping of wheat. And this still astounds me that maybe it says more about the wheat industry in 1870s, but according to Red Wing histories that I have read, it was, and that's the language that these histories use, in the 1970s, the largest primary wheat market in the world. So more wheat was coming, I guess, from Goodhue, Dakota, and Rice counties, specifically to Red Wing, and then because they were functioning as a port. So Red Wing also was attending to the needs of early educational institutions. The first schoolhouse was built in that very first year, and I think within 20 years they had built a fairly large. Or no, in '65 they built the first central school, which I think was middle and high school. And I was also surprised to discover that Red Wing was birthplace of two colleges, two present Minnesota colleges. Hamlin, I was aware of Hamlin, and they were located, what, a block or two from this site, right? And Gustavus Adolphus, I think Gustavus was here for no more than a year or two before they relocated. And then there's one line in the history that says, a library maintained by Christ Episcopal Church, which is right up here, right? Offered the only means of obtaining circulating literature. Again, I assume that it was probably mostly the members of that church that took advantage of that. But the other interesting thing I thought was in 1873, the Turners, which was a German civic organization and club, they built what's described as an opera house. And sorry, that picture isn't very good. It looked like a spectacular, I don't know how well you can see it, but right on this corner, this very corner is, and it served as a kind of primary meeting space for the town. But it burned down, I think, 10 years after it was built. One other thing about this era, these 40 years before the towns established the public library, as early as 1879, the state of Minnesota, in their general laws, actually had some legislation that encouraged and provided a process by which towns could establish public tax-supported libraries. And there is how it could be done. Citizens could place the question with a petition with enough names. They could place the question of setting up a public library at the next annual election, the same election annually when they were when they were electing mayors and council people. And also, I think interesting, because you may remember that actually till what, when did women get to vote in this country? 1920? Since this law was working through elections, they did have a clause that said women may vote, and you'll notice this was for schools too. Those are the two exceptions, for school officers and members of library boards, and should be eligible to hold office pertaining to the management of the schools or libraries. And in fact, in much of the country, the foundings of public libraries really came out of the efforts of women's organizations and women's clubs, although the early boards tended to still be dominated, you might not be surprised, by men. And that's a page actually from the laws, how to establish a library. And there's three ways: by vote of the city council, by vote of the people, or by efforts of individual citizens. So let's go to Red Wing first. So how did they establish their public library? And as they put in one of the newspapers, what came from the agitation for a library? 1892, that's actually a headline. Well-intended public meeting held at Armory. And then the sub-headline is fully 500 people were present, which that's a lot of people. And the interest they manifested was commendable. And then this is from a newspaper article again. They quote a number of people, and here are two. And it was also not uncommon for those who were engaged, who were promoting the establishment of a public library, to see it not just in educational terms, but kind of moral terms, and that the library was also how you created better people and better citizens. So Father Gughem and Reverend Jennings were just talking about how it'll be good not only for the minds but for the souls of people in Red Wing to have a public library. There we go. That's actually what the article, how the article started. I can't believe I just did it. I'm gonna stop hitting the top right button.
Which one do you want, Bruce? Next one?
I think maybe it's the PC one.
No, which slide do you want?
Yeah, just the next one.
This one?
Yep. And so after this big general meeting, in Red Wing, the mayor, Mr. Putnam, actually set up a committee, a citizens committee, to promote it and just to see how much interest there really was. And they had a number of meetings throughout '93, so that a first meeting was '92. By '93, the mayor actually sets up a citizens committee, and that committee meets for a whole year and has more meetings and even a little bit of fundraising. And then before they actually commit to funding the public library, they did appoint a library board and let that library board work for a full year. And this was happening, I don't know how much of your history you know, but 1893 in this country was the panic of 1893. It was up to that point, it was the greatest financial crisis that this country had experienced. So this discussion about whether we should support a public library with tax money was happening in the context of very difficult economic times. But the board did some fundraising, and by January of '94, and these quotes are from the newspaper, the library had been established. It opened day after New Year's, and 300 people visited, and the library board was there at the door greeting them. And there's a description of the rooms. They had rented some rooms in the Gladstone building. And the Gladstone building is, what street is that on? A few blocks north. On Bush Street. They were in the Gladstone building, the library and reading rooms for only about 5 years. And here's President Neal talking about what the library board did in that first year of existence. Although you see March '93 is when the library board was established. It didn't become a public library until January '94, but they were submitting their first annual report after they had been together for a year. And they raised $725 and had collected that many books for their library, mostly through donations. I should take that thing, so there we go, user mode. The mayor who set up that committee was W.H. Putnam, who was a banker and involved in various businesses and invested in a number of the industries around here. He was incredibly involved. He was mayor for 2 terms. He was on city council, school board, 1 term in the State House, treasurer of his church for 35 years, and served as president of the library board. He was mayor in '92 when this all got started. By '98, he was on the library board and served as president all those years, 26 years as president of the library board. So And that's Mr. Putnam. After about 5 years, they needed more space, and so they moved to another building. The Boxroot, is it pronounced Boxroot or Rudd? Boxroot, which is on, that is Main Street. Main Street, all right. And the newspaper described their new location as handsome quarters, large, light, airy, steam heated, and well ventilated rooms. And so by '98, when they moved, just to kind of get an idea of how many books they had, over 2,600, although fiction and juvenile were 1,500. The more solid classes, I think generally meant nonfiction. Well, it must have meant nonfiction then, that's how they defined it. And had a fair number of magazines. And then the circulation was 8,200 in the very first year, and jumped to almost double, more than doubled the next year, and then more slowly grew. And just to get an idea of how many people were circulating all those books, there were just over 1,000 cars in use in '98. And that's interestingly enough, many of the articles about the library in both towns were not to be found on the front page. As someone who kind of came at library history from first being involved with libraries, I wanted to think that it was always front page news. It wasn't. But when the library opened and when they moved, that is the front page of, as you can see, the November 29th, 1898 Red Wing Daily Republican, and it did make the middle of the front page, and it says, "In new quarters and the public library now established in the Boxroot building." So, Red Wing has established there by 1894, Red Wing has a public library. Back in Northfield, 1891, likewise, they were having some public meetings, and an article in the Northfield News listed some opinions that citizens had in regard to the effort to get a public library. And it's interesting, yeah, to see what they thought the benefits of a library would be. And as you see, those who read are, pardon? That they thought that libraries foster and encourage a reading habit, and that they'll be better citizens, enjoy a better life, and keep you out of trouble. Here's a few more opinions where here, you know, we're a library that has colleges, and you know, we've got people who care about learning, so we should certainly have a library. Why don't we have a library? At Northfielders are voracious readers. But despite that environment and all that rhetoric about how intelligent and Northfield, it took them 5 years to actually convince the voters to support it with tax money. And this was from a newspaper article in '84 where they had talked for a couple years about it. They finally took the April vote, and it needed to get 2/3, so it failed. And this is just kind of a random connection between the two libraries. But on the same page in that newspaper in '94, there was a letter from a banker in Northfield who apparently had been communicating with his banker friend in Red Wing. And for some reason, Mr. Neal, who was the president of your library board, thought he had heard news that it had passed. And so Neal sends to this banker this I'm passing it and saying I'm sure that none of you will ever regret because of this action. And so,
He might have been very sarcastic.
well, maybe, but and so the banker sent this letter, I think, to sort of shame his fellow Northfields into, come on, you know. And that's a copy of the article that has the various quotes about whether we should have a public library and why it's important. Some more quotes from that. And you get some of this rhetoric in Red Wing too. There are some about the boys that need libraries. One other interesting thing that I discovered in both newspapers, in 1898, just before Northfield finally votes in April of that year to create a public library, there was an article that ran in both papers. As you can see in the Red Wing papers on the left, and it's February 3rd, 98. And the Northfield one was a few weeks earlier in January, and it is it's the full address of a professor. I'm not even sure where he's from, but at the dedication of Faribault's Public Library, he gave an address on what is a library for. And in Red Wing, the newspaper opened it up with a paragraph saying that it's important that we read this here in Red Wing, because even though we have a public library, I know there are a lot of you who are still skeptical about the benefits of it. So you folks read it, because we have a professor telling us what is a public library for. Northfield, of course, they were just trying to get people to support it. And just to kind of summarize it, and this was 3 columns, and in the Northfield paper it was the front page, 3 long columns, and it went on and on and on, but 3 primary reasons that this professor thought, why do we need a public library? And interestingly enough, the first is for what he called recreation, although recreation isn't just frivolous stuff. He was just pointing out that reading, and that's supposed to be this function of the public library. iPlace. Oh yeah, that's right. That process is relaxing, and that recreation is a legitimate reason to have access to books. Second is culture, and how we just through our contact with books we obtain culture and learning. And third is wisdom. You've got the recorded wisdom of the world that you can only get through books. So pretty lofty kind of. So a few months after that, the voters vote and they do pass it, and then the city council does create Northfield's Public Library. And since they already had a library in the YMCA building, what they were doing was agreeing to make it public, supply it with tax money, and to pay to maintain the use of that library that existed in the YMCA building. And they make reference right in the resolution to the state law that established libraries. And this is the first paragraph of the article when the library actually opened. And just saying, well, it's about time that we now have a library. And of course, being modest again, they think they've got a collection as fine as possessed by any city of its size in the West. We were in the West then. Okay, so both towns have a public library, but in 1901, it is the first article I at least was able to find where there was some public discussion about why can't Red Wing get a wee slice of Carnegie's beneficence for the public library. The first Carnegie public libraries were built, I think in the early 1890s. First one was in Iowa, a small town in Iowa. And there were already a number of Minnesota towns that had public libraries, although Red Wing was one of the earliest. And the Carnegie gift was just that. It was an outright gift. They would pay for the Carnegie Foundation would pay for the entire cost of constructing the building if the town would commit to, with tax money, support the maintenance of the library. And they came up with a formula which turned out not to be very realistic. But 1/10 of the amount of construction was the annual support. So if you're building a $15,000, if they were going to build you a $15,000 library, you had to commit to an annual support of $1,500 to maintain and run the library. It was kind of, a deal that, well, and since both Red Wing and Northfield already had public libraries and were supporting it with tax money and supporting it with about that much, that they only had to increase their tax slightly. I think it was, I don't know, $300 or $400 a year. So, but the other condition was you had to provide a site, land, and there's Andrew on the left. There's a cartoon at the time of Andrew getting great joy out of building libraries all over the country. And yeah, here was the conditions and formula. And this is a little hard to read, but this is a list from Wikipedia of all the Carnegie libraries in Minnesota. 65 Carnegie libraries were built in total from about 57 grants. And it's alphabetical order. But on the right, number 41 is Northfield, and they got a grant of $10,000, and those dates are when the grant was actually approved, and Northfield's grant was 1908, and there, a few down with that kind of line through it, is Red Wing. And that's the newspaper article of the council unanimously favoring establishing the library. But they still needed a site. And that is, again, it made the front page when Carnegie offered the $15,000. And too fast. There. James Lawther, who was a businessman and owned a great number of properties, buildings, even I think at some point more than 20 farms in the area. He just seemed to invest in a lot of property. Who at this time, though, was not even living in Red Wing. His The Lothars had had, I just believe, one son, and that son had died of typhoid in his early 20s. And when the Lothars were retiring, they went back to Ireland, but still maintained their contact. And so he was aware of the need, and he, and this was one of the properties he owned, this very site where we are now, and offered the money, but dedicated to his son. So the Lothar in the Carnegie Lothar Library is not James, but it's for his son. It's named after his son. 1903, they had ceremonies in the armory, and they dedicated the building. And that's what it looked like. And it was literally, I think, more to my right, on the corner, but very close to where we are right now. And this is looking from, what, yeah, from the park. Yep. And this is actually from a brochure in '53 when they were celebrating their 50th, but although I think the pictures are from earlier. And that's an interior shot, and looks like the same exterior shot. Yeah, it was, those tables look, yeah, great. And there is a postcard of the library, and I think looks like in one of its very earliest years. This is, the landscaping's not much. I was guessing this was the 40s. Those of you who know cars better, is that 40s or 50s? It is 40s, okay. Again, looking from the park. And this is a page from the 50th anniversary, showing shots of the various library services at the Carnegie Lothar Library. And you see the person in the middle on the right is, do you know what that machine is that he's buried into? That's one of the first, I think, yeah, it's a, well, they didn't call them microfiche, did they? But he's looking at newspapers. So they had those as early as the 50s, I guess. Okay, back to Northfield. How did Northfield get its Carnegie Public Library? Again, with their modest self-image, they said we're an exceptionally enterprising town, and then they talked about everything they had, and that we could easily provide you $1,200 a year. So they were going after a $12,000 library. And again, just like Red, look what Red Wing has. In the years before, when they were just starting to think of about getting a Carnegie Library, they happened to, the article on the left, finish by saying, in Red Wing, for instance, the handsome site was, they were talking about, we need to come up with the site, we certainly can come up with the money, was donated by the Lothar estate, and the combined name, Carnegie Lothar, cut in stone over the handsome entrance stands as a perpetual memorial. Is there someone in Northfield who will start the movement by furnishing a site? And in a similar article just saying Northfield has outgrown its present one. Northfield can have a $13,000 Carnegie building for the asking, which turned out not to be true. Carnegie only offered them $10,000. And he offered an amount based strictly on the population of the town. And so again, no one has offered a site, and they talk about the Red Wing plan, which provided a handsome memorial building with a double name is worth considering, so. Carnegie offers Northfield 10,000, and maybe not surprising, they wanted more. So they actually sent a series of letters that following summer to Carnegie. The letters didn't really go directly to Carnegie. They went to someone who was handling all of this. But they tried to convince them that, you know, I know you think we only need a $10,000 library, but we're a college town, and we just needed an attractive library. They'd even talked about, Carleton had just built a $25,000 library, and St. Olaf was about to finish one, and they said, you know, the rest of the citizens need something just as grand. So, but Carnegie, or just sent kind of a curt letter saying, I think you can build it with 10,000, so proceed. They dedicated it in 1910, and that's what it looked like. Actually, there are more flattering pictures of it, but as you see, compared to Red Wing, it was smaller, and because of where it was located, they built it to look a little more residential. It doesn't have that classic monumental, you know, so it just seemed more like a cozy little small-town library.
Did someone donate land?
They did, but they didn't want, or the city didn't feel that they needed to name the library after them. So, and in fact, the Northfield Public Library was never officially even the Northfield Carnegie Library, even though it did say Carnegie above the door, but they always refer to themselves just as the Northfield Public Library. So now, jump to the middle part of this century, and here in Red Wing, we need a bigger building. And to make their case, because it was put to a referendum to fund it, they just demonstrated how the number of books had increased 620% from when the building was built to 66. Circulation had increased that much, and the population, although the population of Red Wing had only increased 40%. And another big issue that people were finally thinking about was accessibility. You had to go up all those steps, and even within the library, the Carnegie Library, in both places, in most places, was on 2 floors. So that there were issues both getting into the library and getting around the library. And there were 3 main options about what they might do, and they could renovate or expand the present building. They could figure out another use for that building, because people did love that Carnegie Library, and construct a new building elsewhere, or they could demolish the building and build a new facility right here. So how did they figure out what to do? Well, a number of reasons, a number of factors determined what they finally did. When they had some remodeling plans done, they were convinced they just couldn't really meet all their needs by expanding the building as it was on that site. Also, at that time, there was federal grant money available for library construction, but only for new library construction, and not for renovation. And they also, the land had been given on the condition that this would be the permanent site of the public library. So they put all those together, and finally the library consultants that they hired, and I think Edna was right with them, recommended that the most efficient library is a 1-story library. So reluctantly, I would think, for some.
Edna was a visionary.
So they recommended the city council that they demolish the building. It goes to referendum to have $250,000 of the cost come from the taxpayers, and the federal grant was $200,000, I believe. And it passed, although only by 6 votes, I think. Yeah. And unfortunately, it was indeed demolished. And I should have rotated these around for you, but this gives you an idea of, this is the footprint. The darkened area is the footprint of the old library. And then the outside lines show you the footprint of the present library. Yeah, this is actually taken from the program of when they dedicated the new library. No, the one on the left is a little flyer they put together, because I see in the corner it says, "Why a yes vote?" And it's got all those statistics you saw earlier. The one on the left in the right-hand corner, if you can tilt your head, cites all those statistics about why we need a library, so vote yes. And fortunately enough, people did. I thought I had a picture of your new library. But, all right, quickly back to Northfield. It took until about 1980 for Northfield to decide they needed a new library. Again, just like Red Wing, it was overcrowded. And they had accessibility issues, and they had a consultant come in and not surprisingly tell them that the public library space is totally inadequate. And this was an editorial in the news where they certainly agreed that we're going to have to build a new library, but they were already talking about how dearly they would love to maintain the library they had. A week after that last editorial, a group from the League of Women's Voters in Northfield, and you probably can't read that, but the first sentence says, after participating in the League of Women's Voters tour of the Red Wing Public Library last Saturday, there's still a big question in our mind about whether Northfield's building ought to be destroyed. And they actually loved what they saw here. And you might notice underneath, I think it's a drawing, not a photograph of your present library. They called it a beautiful new building. They loved the light. They loved that it was made with brick and not concrete. And so they actually, this is an editorial in the paper, they were suggesting that we leave the Carnegie one and then build something like that right next to it in Northfield. But the conversation went on, and since it was the early 1980s, and Northfield already had a historic preservation commission, and just people were thinking differently about their old buildings than they were in the 60s. There just was growing support for figuring out some way to expand the present building and to restore it and maintain it. And so they had and this was despite the fact that the library consultants had recommended they not do it. But so they convinced the council that we should expand the present building. And about a year later, they have a referendum, passes with 58% of the vote. But 2 months later, a petition shows up at the city council with 282 signatures, and I put that in there because there were 280, that 58% was 282 votes. And they just wanted symbolically to show that even though that many people who turned out to vote wanted to support the referendum, that an awful lot of people in Northfield didn't think it was the right time. They wanted to postpone it. They weren't against expanding it, but early 80s was another economic downturn time, you might remember. And, but the city council says, you know, the voters have spoken. We're going to proceed and do it. And then the same group actually filed suit against the city, and it went all the way to the state Supreme Court. But they eventually lost that, and the city council still was kind of stalling. But so it took, between the referendum and took almost 3 years before they actually had a new library. Yep. And that's what it looked like. But that's not really a good shot, because what it shows you, I should have gotten one that draws back more. What they did is they built 2 wings along the old library and built them at a scale and then put one roof over it, that it still resembled the old building, and inside they actually kind of blended it quite seamlessly and extended all the woodwork, and the windows were all the same. So I think, how many of you have been in the Northfield Library? You know, people who see it for the first time don't often realize that that there's an old part and a new part. It really was.
Did they need additional property?
No, it all fit on the property they had. So we'll just kind of wrap up very quickly with each library had celebrated their centennial, and that is the top and bottom of the newspaper insert. And as I think I mentioned earlier, we've got some in the back, so why don't you take it with you. The newspaper insert that really was the first history done of the library. And there's a list of all the articles, and two of those authors of articles in there are here with us today, right? Catherine and Janet. And Susan was the children's librarian then, is that correct? And Gene Robinson, I think, was on the board when the new building was built, and so he was writing about that in there. And Betsy was a reference librarian. And that's what, yeah, she was writing about. And did a whole year of programs and celebrating. And interestingly enough, when we in Northfield did our centennial celebration 4 years later, one of our displays was American Girl dolls. That must have been the rage then, I guess. I don't know if we stole that from you, but. And what did you get a good turnout to the book reading presentation?
Yes.
Yes, I would think
Yes,
you would
that
have.
was shown.
Because and she had just fairly recently written a book about
Yeah, called Reading Rooms.
called Reading Rooms about libraries. So yeah. And a puppet show. You had an active puppet, an ongoing puppet show program, right, for years.
Yeah.
It's gone though.
Yeah.
Yeah.
The puppets are gone.
The puppets are gone too. 4 years later, Northfield did one, and they called theirs Celebrating a Century of Service, and didn't have an extensive insert, but had a little brochure about the history of the library, and an exhibit at the public library. And our highlight of then was also bringing in a Minnesota author, and we had John Hassler. And that was the brochure with a number of things going on there. So I said, you know, that this would focus mostly on buildings and the city supporting the library, but I just want to real quickly acknowledge that you know, the really important work of the library is what happens when people come to the library, and not just as a place to pick up books, but the interactions with the staff, and of course, public libraries are guided by and run by boards. Red Wing has a governing board, and throughout its history, particularly in the early years, it was the board that actually, helped. They were doing everything. I mean, they were visiting other libraries and just trying to figure, because they, for one thing, had very small staffs at the beginning, but the library board in Red Wing, and I assume this is still the case, it's really hands-on management and working with the staff to run and operate it. But because you have a governing board here, when you hire new library directors, the board hires them, not the city, where in Northfield, you're hired by the city to be the library director. I only went through 1970 here, but these are some of the early library board, or all the early library board presidents of the Carnegie Lother days. So you see that in the early years between Putnam and Cook, they went more than half a century, which is a lot of continuity. And I just happened to run across that. And I was hoping Chuck would be here today. Yeah, so anyways, that's what the library board consists of 9 people, so someone's missing, right? There's only eight there. Can you read the names? Yeah. And I assume that might be right here. The background looks like,
I bet it's that corner.
probably that corner. Is that really probably that? Yeah. Oh. You know what? I should have done that earlier. But now I can't, yeah. Northfield Library Board is advisory, and so they advise the director and the city manager on hiring and budget, and don't hire or fire. They're involved, but they don't hire or fire or make directly budget decisions. And library directors, and they weren't called directors in the early years. They were the librarian or head librarian. Here's the first 9, and a number of people had some pretty short. And there is, so you've had 15 directors. And I just thought I'd throw in a picture of Edna. And that was when she was, I don't know where that would have been taken. Not in the library, it must have been somewhere else. But at the time she retired, well, it said in her room, so. Huh. Would her office have had skylight? No.
Unless those are lights.
Well, I'm not sure they are. Yeah. And Northfield's only had 12. And Northfield's present library director has been there since '85. And this is a page out of the book that, again, has all the Northfield library directors. And, I didn't finish this chart, so I probably, but maybe just one thing to look at, because I know James at one point asked me, why, looking at it from the present time, why does Northfield have, why might Northfield have a much bigger circulation? But for many years, Northfield didn't. I mean, Northfield's jump in circulation, I mean, if you look at 1970, it was only half of Red Wing's circulation, although Northfield was originally about half the size of Red Wing, if you go back to 1900. It has slowly closed the gap, and now, but when you see Northfield's population, starting in 1950, they started counting students from the two colleges. So Northfield's present 20,000 is about 15,000 non-students. And even though students can use the public library, they don't a lot. But Northfield circulation between 70 and 90 and then 10 just did incredible jumps. And so I don't know why, I'm still going to be doing more research here. But any of you have any thoughts as to why?
Well, how do you count circulation?
Well, and it's not just books, it's items that move.
Right. And.
It's items
doesn't it
checked
make
out.
it- Right,
Mhm.
so the length of time that items are checked out would make a difference.
It could, yeah, those numbers
Right.
can be really misleading.
Yeah.
Yeah, and you don't know if, for some reason, Northfield has people that check out lots of books, even if they don't read them, or,
Or if
You
you
know,
check
that
out once a
include,
week in your renewal.
Does that include like DVD?
yeah, absolutely,
Yeah.
absolutely.
That-
And
that
I
might be
think,
an issue.
and James could tell me, I think Northfield's DVD and CD collection is much larger.
When I think about that.
Is that right? Is it much larger here? No?
It's significantly larger and significantly more accessible. When you walk into the door of the Northfield Public Library, you're sorry, let me say it differently. You run right into the DVD
Right.
collection. So that's the first thing you see when you come into the Northfield Public Library. It's the most easily accessible collection in the Northfield Public Library.
Yep.
So, it's right in front of you.
Yeah.
And isn't part of the discussion now that libraries are about more than just things that you take away from the library? It's the interaction that you have in a library with computers and things like that. And we haven't really been measuring those things.
That's an interesting conversation, because in the context of the county negotiations, that's
Yeah.
something we were trying to account for. And the,
Yeah.
what's the little good Hugh, not Zumbrota, what's the other smallest one?
Cannon Falls.
Not Cannon Falls,
Pine Island.
Pine,
Pine Island.
no, Canyon.
Oh, Canyon.
You have to sign in Canyon. That's how they count. You sign in Canyon.
Oh.
That
Your
could be
name.
good for a lot of reasons.
Well, privacy issues.
Sign in for what?
Sign in that you attended, that you walked in the door.
Oh.
Like a guest.
Like a
list.
guest book. And that is how they are accounting for attendance of people actually in the
Yeah.
library doing
Yeah.
something.
Yeah.
But I actually had a conversation with James Hill last night, I think. But why couldn't you do a ratio of, gate counts, people coming in
Yeah.
versus circulation, and figure out that ratio?
Exactly.
That these people are coming in for something.
Yeah.
And circulation shouldn't, I don't think, be, certainly not the only, and maybe not even the primary measure, or just one of the primary measures. I think you're absolutely right. And now, of course, you can use your library services from home, and so
Right.
you're not measuring that anymore. So not only
Well-
who comes and uses it, but,
Yeah.
I mean, you're right, that if you take a book out from home, that is getting measured, but,
But reference services,
Yeah.
talking to staff.
those are all important.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
Hey, Catherine?
I have a couple of things to say about differences, and one of them is that it was only after I came in '92 that the Red Wing Public Library became part of the Salco computer system. Before that, we were standalone, and there was really no interlibrary loan either. And I'm assuming circulation includes interlibrary
Oh,
loan.
absolutely. Yeah.
And that made one difference. The other thing is, I remember one of my first visitors was Chuck Richardson, who had been on the library board, and you saw a photo of him there. He walked into my office and he said, "I want you to know this is a print library."
He did the same thing to me on my first day.
Yes.
He confronted me in the middle of the library. He did the same thing to me. See, these are the stories that need to be in these books. Sure. And what he does to library directors to intimidate them. In his way. He's a great guy.
Oh, wonderful. I mean, I can't praise Chuck enough. He has brought a lot of bequests to the library.
But he
But
says he
he's-
values the print
He
part of it.
values print, and that's a history I walked into, and James walked into. And also, if you look at our DVD collection, a lot of those DVDs are based on books. I mean, so you do have different philosophies of collection building and what.
And you have people from academic backgrounds, at least
Right.
mine is, I think.
Mine's academic as
See,
well.
and then I think we've had others that have been academic backgrounds.
Anyway, you know, it's really hard to compare
It is.
institutions and people and what's going on, but it's important because it's linked to funding.
Right. Well, that's an interesting comparison, is the endowments between both libraries. Did you look into how the funds were all, because you talk about bequests, you know, the endowment funds, I think, are different, how they're used.
And yes,
The
we
gifts.
set up an endowment fund.
Right.
Yes.
And I think it's different how they're set up and how you can use the money. The other thing is, you know, you didn't go into this a little bit, but did you touch on, or, you know, the library board was voted out of existence in Red Wing.
You know,
Did you not find, or didn't you
No.
talk to me about that, Catherine?
Oh, yes, and
what do you mean voted on?
back in early 70s, when the city charter was being revised, partly because of the annexation of Burnside, because of the nuclear plant being built, they looked at all of the boards, city boards, and they eliminated a lot of them. And they had a water board, there was a park board, as well as a library board. And when you look at the charter prior to that year and then the charter after, and the reason I could do that is Janet and Betsy made sure we had copies of the city charters through its history. All of a sudden, the library board disappears. There is no library board.
You mean no
But-
city library board?
No,
Someone wants to do
no city library board.
that. Disappear, okay.
But the library board, these people were very wise, they went back to, again, the state. And if a city is a charter city and it does not mention a library board, the state still says you can have a library
Then you become a
board.
So
statutory
they
city.
recreated themselves.
They just carried on.
And they have more power as a statutory. So they even had more power then.
And so when I came and became aware that the city charter did not recognize a library board, I thought it would be good, you know, to get this in the city charter. There's a city charter
So
commission.
now it is. The
Oh, yes,
board of-
and Steve Perkins was the city administrator after Dean Massett retired. And the library board said, we want to hire an attorney to help us work with the city to fix this in the city charter. And Chuck Richardson, of course, came to our rescue and did on a pro bono basis. He and I met with Steve Perkins and came up with what the library board was going to be. And it's now part of the city charter. And it very clearly says the library board governs library matters, personnel, collections,
Policy
policies,
matters.
all the things that library boards want to be a part of, including the hiring of the library director. And the city is responsible for personnel policies, seeing that library employees are city employees and being on the city salary and so on. So, yes, the library board was very wise and just carried on.
So I think going forward, there's two areas, you know, these endowment funds we both have and how they've been used over the years, because that was also included in the building of this building, a little bit of that, a gift.
A bequest,
A bequest,
not an
which-
endowment, but a bequest.
But then also I think a little bit more into this library board, what the matter and how it's written today.
Yeah.
It's a shared responsibility, where prior to what Catherine was talking about in the old charter, the library board ran everything, it was written that way.
Mhm.
And then it went away, and then it came back as kind of a hybrid, where the library employees are now city employees.
Right.
City manager has authority over the employees, but the library board has authority over all policies, and they share supervision over the director.
So Red
It's
Wings-
really an interesting,
Red Wings board may be quite unique.
it is unique,
It is.
and I think it's a really
Because it's-
nice, interesting story.
Yeah.
And Chuck was part of it.
Well, I met with Chuck and asked him about that, and I said, can you talk some about them? And he didn't seem to remember that he. So that's why I didn't have a full explanation. I'll ask about it again, I don't know, maybe you misunderstood my question.
I'm surprised there aren't notes somewhere.
Well,
No,
all the
I'm-
charters are in Bill brought when I first showed up. You know, Bill gave me the charter folder, and then 15 minutes later, Chuck came in and read the file. But in my office, I've got the charter history in there, and you probably created that.
Yeah, I think
So
I
it's up
did,
there.
I tracked it.
But I hadn't talked, because Catherine and I had a conversation about 3 weeks ago about this, so I didn't know about this until we talked.
Do you know when the Friends were founded? Here? Is there a specific year?
Janet?
Or approximately?
That was when, that must have been in the 80s. I would say mid to late 80s. I know Abby Olson talked a little bit about that. She was part of getting, do you remember that, Nancy? I don't know.
Yeah, I don't know.
She was
but
part of getting
Before
that
that,
started.
they just had like volunteers that came to the library, but they didn't officially call them friends, so, you know, I think that was, like you said, in the 80s.
Yeah, they had a small group that wanted to get
So-
involved.
And then I would say the early 90s, they became a 5013C
Oh, they did, okay.
and were formalized and that sort of thing. So, and in the last 30 years, the Friends have been just a huge part of what happens in this library.
And that's very similar to Northfield. The Northfield Friends appeared at the time they were discussing the new library, so 82, 83.
Just a quick comment.
Yes.
I belong to an organization in Red Wing called the Art History Club.
Oh,
And
Yes.
that club was started in 1902.
and affiliated with the library?
No,
No.
no,
Okay.
but though I'm not a charter member, when we celebrated our 100th anniversary, we made a really intensive reading and study of our minutes over those